We sent a microscopic animal into the cold, dead vacuum of outer space, and it didn't care. In September 2007, a capsule called Photon M3 was orbiting low above the Earth, spinning slowly for thermal control, one side baking in direct sunlight, while the other dropped into freezing shadow. Bolted to its outer hull was a small tray, no bigger than a paperback, holding thousands of animals invisible to the naked eye. The lid slid open. There was no seal, no shielding, nothing between them and open space. No pressure, no oxygen. Solar radiation strong enough to strip DNA apart, and surface temperatures swinging from over 100 degrees Celsius in sunlight to nearly -80 in shadow. For 10 straight days, that tray stayed open to the void. Then the capsule fired its engines, re-entered the atmosphere, and parachuted down into Kazakhstan. Scientists opened the tray back in the lab, added a few drops of water, and the animals inside simply woke up. Some of them went on to lay eggs that hatched normally, as if nothing had happened at all. This is the water bear. And before we go any further, let's clear something up. It is not an insect. It's not even in the same broad category as insects at all. Tardigrades belong to their own entirely separate branch of the animal kingdom, more closely related, oddly enough, to velvet worms than to anything with 6 legs. Under a microscope, they look almost cartoonish. 8 stubby legs, a rounded body, a face that somehow reads as both alien and strangely endearing. Fully grown, most species are barely half a millimeter long. And despite that, this is arguably the single most indestructible animal ever measured by science. So how does something this small survive something that would kill nearly every other living creature on Earth almost instantly? And here's what makes that question even stranger. This isn't some rare exotic animal confined to one remote habitat. Scientists have identified well over 1,000 distinct tardigrade species, and they've been found on every continent on this planet, including Antarctica. They live at the tops of the Himalayas, in the crushing depths of the deep ocean, in hot springs, and in the thin film of water on a single piece of moss growing on a garden wall or a roof gutter a few feet from your front door. If you scraped a small sample of damp moss or lichen from almost anywhere on Earth and looked at it under a basic microscope, there's a real chance you would find one, going about its day, completely unaware that it's arguably the most physically indestructible animal alive. The answer starts with a trick most animals can't do at all: shutting down completely, on command, and then starting back up again later, as if no time had passed. Picture a water bear living in a patch of moss on a garden wall. For weeks it lives an ordinary life, moving through the wet film between the moss fibers, eating algae and bacteria. Then the moss dries out in the sun. Within minutes, the water bear's body starts changing. It pulls its 8 stubby legs in against its body, curls into a tight wrinkled ball smaller than the head of a pin, and expels almost all of the water from inside its own cells. Scientists call this the tun state, and inside it, the water bear's metabolism drops to a level so close to zero, it's difficult to even measure. It isn't sleeping, it isn't hibernating. In every practical sense, it has paused itself, and it can stay paused like this for years. Some tons recovered from decades-old dried moss samples in museum collections have been rehydrated and walked away within hours, as if no time had passed since the day they curled up. But pausing your body isn't enough on its own, because removing nearly all the water from your cells should destroy them, not save them. Water is what keeps proteins folded correctly and membranes intact. It's the medium almost every biological process depends on. Take it away entirely and suddenly, and most cells collapse into a wrecked, unusable mess within minutes, which is exactly what happens to nearly every other animal that dries out. This is where the water bear's real trick shows up. As it dehydrates, its cells flood with a sugar called trehalose, along with a set of unique tardigrade proteins that behave almost like biological packing material, wrapping around delicate structures before they have a chance to fall apart. Together, they form something closer to glass than liquid, a stable, vitrified structure that holds every protein and membrane exactly in place, frozen in position at the molecular level, waiting for water to return and for the whole system to simply pick back up where it left off, sometimes years or decades later. And that solves dehydration. It does not solve radiation, which is where things get even stranger. Ionizing radiation doesn't just damage a cell, it shreds DNA directly. tearing the genetic code apart at the molecular level, strand by strand. For a human being, a dose of around 5 units called grays is enough to be fatal, and a few hundred CT scans worth would already be more radiation than most people will ever absorb in a lifetime. Certain tardigrade species have been measured surviving doses in the thousands of grays. Some studies put the figure at roughly 1,000 times the human lethal threshold, with their DNA visibly shattered under the microscope in the hours after exposure, and then stitched back together, gene by gene, within days. In 2016, researchers identified part of the mechanism behind that recovery: a tardigrade-specific protein named DSUP, short for damage suppressor, that physically wraps around the animal's DNA like packing material and shields it from the destructive molecules radiation generates inside a cell. Scientists didn't stop at observing it. They took the gene for DSUP and inserted it directly into human cells growing in a lab dish. Those human cells became measurably more resistant to radiation damage. A water bear's defense system, borrowed wholesale and running inside human tissue that had never evolved anything like it. If an animal you could fit on the head of a pin can shrug off radiation that would kill you 1,000 times over, hit like on this one. Because we're not done with what this creature can survive. Because vacuum and radiation aren't even the full list. Tardigrades have been chilled to within a fraction of a degree of absolute zero, colder than anywhere naturally occurring on Earth, and revived without apparent injury once warmed. They've been compressed to pressures far beyond anything found in the deepest ocean trenches and walked away unharmed. They've been boiled, frozen solid in ice for over 30 years in one documented case, and dried out completely for what researchers estimate could be decades at a time. Every one of these is a completely different kind of physical stress. Thermal in one case, chemical in another, mechanical in a third, and the ton state, combined with trehalose and its arsenal of protective proteins, appears to shrug off nearly all of them by the same basic method: shut down, seal everything in place, and wait for conditions to improve. That's not quite the end of the story either. This entire mission wasn't even the last time tardigrades left Earth. In 2011, a separate batch was carried to the International Space Station and exposed to microgravity in an experiment called Tardicus to study how the space environment affects their gene activity over longer stays. In 2019, an Israeli lunar lander named Bereshit crashed on the surface of the moon while carrying thousands of dehydrated tardigrades in its payload, tucked inside a data archive meant to preserve information about Earth. Whether any of them survived that impact is still genuinely unknown. The lunar surface offers no water to rehydrate them and confirm one way or the other. But it means there is, at minimum, an open scientific question about whether the toughest animal on Earth is also currently sitting, dormant, on the surface of another world. So does that mean the water bear is built for space? Not quite. And this is the part most viral posts about tardigrades skip entirely. The 2007 experiment didn't prove tardigrades thrive in space. It proved they can survive brief exposure to it in a completely dormant, dried-out state. The exact same state they use to survive a puddle drying up in your garden, or a patch of moss freezing over in winter. They weren't adapted for orbit, because orbit isn't a selection pressure that has ever existed on Earth. They were adapted for surviving conditions here that are unstable enough, often enough, that space itself for 10 days barely registered as an upgrade in difficulty. It's not that evolution built an astronaut. It's that evolution built a survivor so extreme over hundreds of millions of years of drying puddles and freezing moss that the vacuum of space turned out to be just another Tuesday. That distinction matters because it's also what makes tardigrades genuinely useful to actual space science, rather than just an internet curiosity. Astronauts on a future mission to Mars would spend at least 6 months each way absorbing cosmic radiation with essentially no atmosphere to filter it. One of the largest unresolved medical risks in human spaceflight, and one no engineering solution has fully solved. Researchers studying DSUP and the other proteins tardigrades use for radiation defense aren't trying to send water bears to Mars themselves. They're trying to reverse engineer the exact molecular tools that let something survive radiation exposure at that scale, in the hope that some piece of that toolkit, a gene, a protein, even just the underlying mechanism, can eventually be adapted to protect a human crew making that same 6-month crossing. Subscribe to 6 Legs Deep for more of the natural world's most extreme survival stories, the creatures nobody expects, doing things that sound impossible until you check the research. Here's what's worth sitting with: a creature smaller than a grain of sand, can survive conditions that would end nearly every other form of life on this planet in seconds, using nothing but sugar, a handful of unique proteins, and the ability to simply pause. If something this small solved survival this completely, what does that say about everything else we've assumed is fragile?